Welcome to Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. An e-zine of the Futures Forum live online. We exchange ideas, information, and inspiration about the futures we want. Get Future Sense Now with host Dr. Claire Nelson, futurist and editor of Human Futures.
Well, so the story continues, and we are being joined by Ambassador Mohau Pheko from South Africa. And she is, as she likes to put it in very simple terms, a political activist, an advocate for change, a daughter, a mother, and for our purposes, very importantly, she is a farmer. And so we want to talk to her about, in this segment, we want to talk to her about, on Future Sense Now, this idea of making sense of a future where we have climate change, we need food security, and as we celebrate Women's History Month, with this exploration into the future history of women 2030 and beyond, we want to ensure how do we link this issue of SDG 1, which is no poverty, SDG 2, which talks about hunger, and SDG 5, which talks about women. So without further ado, I want to thank you, Ambassador Mohau Pheko. I'm trying to get that little silent H in there, for joining me from South Africa. How are you?
I'm very well, and thank you so much for having me on this program. I think it is such an important moment for all of us as women, and I'm so happy that you're talking to women from around the world about futures, and I think it's tremendous. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm really grateful. First of all, when I found out you're a farmer, I got excited about that because, you know, many of us are moving away from farming. Many people think moving away from farming is the way to go. But when we look at the SDGs and we look at the fact that as humans we'll have to eat, despite the movement to manufacture more meat or fake meat, impossible meat, or to manufacture lab-grown cells of beef or whatever, the fact remains that humanity will require that we continue to eat. So I want to start our conversation by saying, as we think about the grand scheme, Agenda 2030, that says, between now and 2030, end poverty and hunger everywhere, combat inequalities within and among countries, and to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. Situate yourself for me in 2030 and how you see us emerging and your work emerging in that space. What does 2030 feel like? How does it feel like it's coming along for you?
I think that in 2030, certainly we will have made a major paradigm shift. Not because we want to, but out of necessity. It's an imperative. We can't keep farming in the way that we are farming now, purely because we are confronted by climate. It's a reality for us. And if we want to secure food, we have to think differently about it. Not only about farming itself, but we also have to think differently about the type of food we eat, about the whole lifestyle of health, and linking that to how people work, how people live, and how to preserve future generations. And I see 2030 as a key turning point, I would say. I wouldn't say that we will have arrived by 2030, because I think that there are so many other elements that need to go into this. You need political will. You need women to be adequately financed. You need women to be able to access land, and you need to be women to be able to access different kinds of resources also for a different way of farming. So if we do things right, 2030 should give us the opportunity to have the type of farming that enables us, number one, not only just to bring food closer to people, which I think is very, very critical right now. We are urbanizing very quickly. By 2030, most African cities, most major African cities will be 50% or more urbanized. And this is a critical factor. We can't keep talking about rural farming if people are moving to cities. And that will necessitate that we also change the nature of how we farm. It may not be field farming. It will be urban farms. What we are doing now is turning derelict buildings, turning warehouses into farms that can create sustainable food. And this is very, very critical.
What kind of food are you farming in these warehouses?
What we're doing in the warehouses now is growing herbs. And you have to bring the whole reason why we think urban farming is important, besides the fact that you don't want your food traveling for miles and miles and getting to the market wilted and unhealthy for people. But it is to, again, regenerate, re-inspire a whole generation of younger women who can come into the farming. Women are farming now. 59% of the farming industry is conducted by women. They don't own the farms, but by bringing it closer to women, this certainly gives them the opportunity to do so. In the warehouses, you are able to convert these spaces into farms, maybe a 10,000 square meter warehouse, for example, would be growing food on perhaps 30 hectares of land. So if you layer either going up or going wide, it certainly gives more food growing per square meter. So that's one thing. It's faster growing as well. You are controlling the manner in which the food grows because you are controlling for climate. So that brings new technologies as well into the farming industry. Yeah. And you are also bringing new growing methods. So you are also upskilling women to be better growers so that you have the best product on the market.
I want to step back a little bit. We cannot jump straight into it, and I did like that. But I want to understand a little bit more about the space in which you're working. I've only been to Durban, and I certainly had no time to visit the city as there's a conference. But tell me, you are where, in Johannesburg?
I'm in Johannesburg.
Right. So the news coming out of Johannesburg for most of us is it's like chaos. Sounds like chaos, but obviously I know, for someone like myself who goes back and forth between Kingston, Jamaica, and Washington, D.C., Kingston sounds like chaos from the outside. So I'm always surprised when I land and see that, oh, life is actually normal. So we're how many years now out of apartheid? We have a situation where we still have, high levels of inequality despite the law. The government has not been able to really treat with the issue of land reform in a way that we would have liked to see. As an activist, I'm working with women, and yes, you're working with urban women. As an activist, though, from a national scale, how do you see this issue of the fact that we have women farmers? Is it that traditionally the land was always owned by the group anyway, and therefore that still remains okay? Or is it that you have like two systems juxtaposed where on the one hand in the mainstream society it is privately held land, in the tribal society it is communally held land, and the banking systems of, let's say, the mainstream have not changed to allow these traditional ways of being to be part of the system? What is happening? I need to understand. Could you explain that for me?
We are 26 years since the first democratic election. So in a sense, democratically speaking, we are toddlers.
Yeah.
That's a fact. And in a way, we have to be a little bit patient with ourselves. And I think it's important to be that, because it helps us to really clean up the policy space in order to really, I think, confront the challenges that face us. And they are numerous. We have one of the worst Gini coefficients in the world, in that we are one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal society in the world. And of course, that stems from our own history as South Africa, which lived under apartheid for many, many generations. And it is going to take another many generations to transform those relationships. And I think at the center of this is the question of land redistribution. You will recall that prior to colonialism, we were people who owned land. I speak for my own family. My parents, my grandparents owned land. They had livestock. They had farms. They were able to sustain themselves from the land. Now, with the law called the Group Areas Act, government was able to remove African people from the best land into what one would look at as similar to American reservations. The Bantu homelands is what we called them. So they moved them into these reservations, took away their ability to farm because there was no land there. They couldn't keep livestock there. Very deliberate policy of the government there, and essentially broke down and destroyed the entire agricultural system and the entire way of people's ability to sustain themselves. This is really fundamental. And generations of this destruction means that we have to retrain new generations to rethink and reimagine ourselves as a new society. What would we look like? What does the future actually look like for us as we reimagine ourselves? And perhaps this is where government has not really got it. You know, they've not understood the need to reinvent a new country that moves us away from this inequality, and in a sense left the land questions, in fact compromised the whole issue of the land question by putting in clauses in there around property rights, where you have a willing seller, willing buyer. We know that this type of policy has never worked anywhere on the African continent, and it is certainly not going to work for African people to buy back land which was actually stolen from them. So the premise on which you start the willing seller, willing buyer is fundamentally flawed. And yet it is the center of power relations. Land is the center of power relations in this country, not only in terms of agriculture. We are a rich mining jurisdiction in this country. We own diamonds, we own platinum, we own gold. So it is not just agricultural land, but it is the resources of production that African people still do not own, because that power is still held by a white minority, which still controls a large portion, in fact, a major portion of this economy. So when you bring in the financing and you bring in the banking system, they don't see African people as bankable people or as people who have the ability to actually borrow money in order to make themselves more productive. So you have a lot of unbanked people in this country who should. You still have millions of women who cannot access credit from your banking system. So these are huge challenges. There's a big debate right now around whether we should expropriate land from the white minority. It's a huge debate in this country. And it's a necessary debate. It's a fundamental, in fact, debate if we are to move forward. Because as I said, it affects your agriculture, your food security. It affects your means of production through the mining industries. Your housing, habitats.
Yeah. One of the questions I have to ask, because I mean, I could talk to you for 3 hours. We'll have to go back, we'll have to bring you back for another issue on food security day. But I want to go back to this issue of this, how to create this future. Because at 26 years old,
yes,
coming out of I'm trying to make a peaceful transition has been very challenging. From our perspective, from outside looking in, we see South African women, so I may speak for myself, I see South African women as being very powerful forces of change. And certainly when you look at the position that some of them occupy, whether it's at the United Nations, that the world tends to see South African women as capable of being leading change. When you look at it in your own country in terms of 2030 and this idea of making change and thrival, how do you think people like yourself, even in the food space now, or in the agriculture ecosystem space, what might have to happen for more of you to come together in a way that's going to create the tipping point for that change to happen?
I think that, we have to go back to the old consciousness raising. I think that never ever ends. Consciousness raising is more important than ever now. Perhaps for my generation, it seems a little bit clearer. But for the generations coming behind us, I think that we really need to connect. I think it needs to be intergenerational. They certainly have many tremendous ideas to bring to the table, just as we have amazing experiences that we can bring to the table. So I think that first, we have to build a consciousness raising about the world that we want, the future that we want to build as women and as a nation. Secondly, I think that we also need to find a new language. Sometimes the words, the expressions, and the paradigms that we use to try and build a new future sometimes tend to be lagging behind. And I think that it's very, very important that for fighting apartheid, we had a language for that. And the language was very clear. We all understood who the enemy was. We need to have this exercise again, and we need to find a language. How do we name this enemy? Who is the enemy now? Because we're in power. We're in power.
Yes.
So it's more complex.
Yes, no, this is very interesting you say that, because the word Ubuntu, for example, has crossed, and a lot of us use it, and because there's no other word we can find in our own language to mean it. And people like myself who come from the Caribbean have been looking back at old words from the Arawak people who almost died off anyway by colonialism, and I can't even find a word in that language to express it because they didn't need it, right? So this Ubuntu idea, there's also the idea of when you have an Indaba, you bring people together, you have this conversation. And I have been saying, because I was very involved in the UN World Cups against racism, I kept on saying, I don't want to be an anti-racist. That is not something. I want to be a blank. So I scratched my head and said, well, what it is. So finally, I started telling people, I support humanism. They said, well, what is that? I said, well, it is the ism that says humanity is one, no matter what your skin color is. And so I use it. It certainly hasn't caught on because you have humanitarianism. That's not it.
Yes.
Humanism is not it. I'm
Yes.
saying that we're moving from this racism where we've been divided into races
Yeah.
to humanity, and therefore it is humanitism.
Right.
In the same way, if we're talking about constructing a new society, perhaps, and we just had a conversation about the idea of donut economics, and a new economic paradigm has to be the driver. So, are you hearing young people, whether men or women, young people coming out of South Africa with these conversations in the cafes about what does a new cooperative or new inclusive economics looks like? Because if you try to develop South Africa on the traditional capitalist structure only, and you don't build in the inclusive and prosperative part, I feel it's going to be a major explosion, because young people are just not going to wait forever for the promised land. Zion has to come soon.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what is exciting about this era here in South Africa are the conversations coming out of the youth structures. And I think what I can point out to one in particular around Feeds Must Fall, where a lot of university students are saying that in order for us to equitably access university studies, the fees must certainly fall. We can afford it as a country. And that's been a very interesting campaign that has also led to the decolonization of education. And, you know, so it's been a very nice intersection that we are seeing, that it is not only just saying that, well, we should have free education, but it is also beginning to talk about the type of education that we need to deconstruct what is there now in order to reconstruct something that is equitable, something that is useful for all of us in order to nation build. So for me, that's extremely exciting. But even more interestingly, I think it is not so much the top down that we are seeing. What we're seeing is people living on the margins in particular, whether it is a protest because they cannot access water, a protest because they cannot access healthcare, they cannot access electricity. We've got 10.3 million youth in this country who are not working. This is tremendously terrible. This is grounds for a major revolution in this country. So you are already seeing a lot of people emerging from different spaces, and I think this is what is beautiful. That it is people living on the margins who are saying, it's miners saying that we're not going to be paid these horrible wages in terms of the type of money that mining houses make. So there is a lot of protest that, look, we cannot continue to live with this inequality. You cannot have a sweeper and a CEO making such a huge difference in salary in one company and expect economic growth. It cannot happen. So I think we are beginning to see a lot of these debates in the cafes, everywhere. I mean, everybody is talking about these issues, but young people in particular are saying that we need a new future. We need something different. This is not it.
Have you thought, as your organization, how much, let's say, lever power does your organization have? Is it big enough to have power, or do you have enough allies in which together you can actually create the conversation about the land piece and see it moving in the next 10 years?
What we are doing right now is building a coalition of different women across the country and in the region, in fact, because this is not only a South African problem, it's a Southern African problem. Okay. It's women throughout the region in all 15 countries in Southern African country that are experiencing and facing the same challenges on land, the same challenges around the ability to produce food and for food security. So we are at the stage, in fact, last week we were discussing how do we connect and how do we intersect the issue of food with healthcare, the issue of food with education, the issue of food, of course, with land, but with water. You know, who has the right to water? And just beginning to talk about these public resources, the right to health. What does that actually mean when you link it to somebody who's HIV/AIDS, who needs to eat good food in order to remain healthy? So it's really not just only the farmers on their own, because I don't think on our own we can do this, but we need to build this very strong coalition where we can begin, I think, to make stronger policy interventions, which I think is really fundamental. But for us, the unique thing that we are doing is that what we are doing is actually trying to create hubs in the city that show that this can be done. And I think this is really important. We're not waiting for government to come help us or anything like that. We're moving on with or without them. But we're beginning to show communities that it is possible for you to grow your own very good food. It is possible for you to keep your children healthy. It is possible to give schools good healthy meals for lunch, etc. So I think this is really, really important. It's a movement for us that is very fundamental, fundamentally grounded in communities, and for us this is very, very important.
Yeah. When do you think your movement, you think, will reach 10% of Johannesburg? In other words, when do you think, or can you prognosticate, if it's a good word, when you think with the allies you're building, maybe in the media, in the filmmaking, in the communication strategies, how do you see yourself reaching to that tipping point of 10% of Johannesburg getting the idea that this can be done?
Fortunately, we have a local government election that is coming up.
Are you running?
But I am supporting. We strongly supporting a number of women, and in fact, I train a number of women on how to run their campaigns, how to occupy the policy space, how to make enough noise, etc. So I think that that's really, really important, and we're targeting young women, because I think that they're in for the long haul, and we don't mind being in the background. And I think for us, that getting critical mass inside local government is absolutely fundamental. We are aiming, at least in the key cities here in this province, which is Johannesburg, which is Tshwane, which is Ekurhuleni, to ensure that in those metropolitans, we have women, not only just women as mayors, but we have critical mass in the local council as well, because there's no point in just putting up a woman there. It doesn't work. It does not work. There's nothing that, the space is violent, the space is difficult for women, and it's important that you surround women with other women, but you also surround them with male champions that will also champion this agenda. This is very fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental. So that's our first goal, is to really begin to push women into these positions of power. But also we have a number of agricultural councils, health councils, etc. Again, it is pushing women into those spaces as well, so that even at the policy space, there is a platform there that articulates the needs of women and the future agenda of what women want and what we want our cities to look like. So I think that's very, very important. For the next national election, certainly, that's a big turning point for us. And we hope that the national election will begin really to put women who are, what shall I say, not the Democrats as we know them, but women who really substantially move agendas forward. And that is sometimes going to mean going against your own political party, which is not easy, but you need the critical mass within those political parties to ensure that the policy space moves in a direction that favors women. And that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, yes, I'm gonna come back to you on that. But I want to, because we almost are out of time, but I have 3 more questions I want to ask you. One is, the first one is, what keeps you up at night? What keeps you up at night in terms of, you know, as you look at 2030, the country has the goals, the global goals are there. You certainly have something to latch your passion to, that you can say, okay, here are the metrics now, and I have 10 years, and you can then go to the quote unquote funders and the supposed corporate supporters and allies to say, hey, you are supposed to help us get to this. But what keeps you up at night in terms of not being able to reach this, or even move your agenda from where you are to some part further along in the direction of which you want to go?
Harmony. What keeps me up at night is harmony, because, you know, you can have a brilliant agenda, you can have brilliant allies, but the world is more complex now. And there is a lot of people who are coerced into other agendas. While there's a lot of double speak. Now you may be moving with somebody, but at night they're talking to somebody else. So keeping ourselves coherent is really, really complicated. It's extremely complicated, and understanding everybody's agenda within coalitions, within networks, is becoming increasingly challenging. You may think that we're like-minded, but you're constantly having to be tested on that. And I think for me, that's what keeps me awake, to think, are those allies still going to be with us when the real debate needs to take place?
That's the reality. That's the reality. Are you optimistic that you will have enough what I call points of leverage? And what do you think those points of leverage that might be to keep you, however, moving forward? Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic? You're an activist, so you have to be optimistic. I'm not going to ask that question. No activist is not optimistic. That's not a question, right?
I'm all 3, Dr. Claire. I'm all 3. I mean, I think that there are days when, you know, you are so optimistic because you see things moving, and you think that you discover that some of the spaces that you've been working on and working within are beginning to transform, and sometimes that comes as a major surprise. And then there are days when you're just so pessimistic because everything that you built up is just on the edge of collapse and tipping over. And, you know, and you just think, well, how are we going to start rebuilding this again? It's a mammoth task. So I think that, you know, you sort of swing from one extreme to the other, but I think I try to keep extremely optimistic, because I think it's important to see the future as possible. Because I think if we start from a position of impossibility, then, I mean, we might as well go home. So I think it's important to think big, to look far ahead, and begin in very small areas to begin to see small changes. They are incremental, and we have to keep making sure that that increment speeds up the pace. But I think that I am optimistic most days. As long as I don't talk to a lot of politicians, I'm fine.
This is so good. Tell me your headline. Tell me your preferred headline. 2030 Johannesburg newspaper / television / micro news on the web, whatever. What does that headline say about women in Johannesburg, the farming movement, the urban farming movement that you're leading? What are you seeing?
Women grow food locally and supply globally. For me, that's a huge one, and I think we have to think huge like that. And I think it is possible to feed the world, and we have been already. This is nothing new, by the way. We've never been given credit for doing it. So I think that in our own hands, it is certainly possible for us to grow locally and feed the world globally. I think this is, for me, this is the 2030 headline that I see.
Well, that's it, folks. I just want to thank you so much, Ambassador Mohau Pheko, for joining me on this element of Future Sense Now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and the very best wishes for this broadcast. I think it's wonderful.
Yes. So if you stay with me as I close out, so thank you for joining us on Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. We have come to the end of a great conversation, but the story continues being written by all of us. Creating the future we want is our shared responsibility. And remember, it is better for us to act as the parent of our future than the child of our past. So as we say in Jamaica, walk good and safe journeys.
Thank you for listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson. Future Sense Now is produced by the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Remember, our futures are embedded in the landscape of our present stories. Seize the day, share this story, and share the future.